Cedarwood was a quiet town nestled in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Its streets were lined with mom-and-pop shops, the kind of businesses that held the fabric of the community together. Among them was Whitaker Auto Repair, a humble but reliable garage owned by Ella Whitaker. She had returned to Cedarwood 5 years ago after the unexpected death of her husband, seeking a fresh start with her then 11-year-old son, Jack. Ella was a woman of quiet strength, her sharp blue eyes betraying the experiences she rarely spoke of. Her days were spent in overalls, fixing engines and managing her shop. Jack, now 16, often helped her after school. A tech-savvy teenager with a sharp wit, Jack spent as much time tinkering with computers as Ella did with car engines. The morning sun filtered through the windows of the garage as Ella wiped grease off her hands, readying herself for another day of work. The garage had a steady flow of customers, mostly locals, with the occasional out-of-towner whose car broke down on the winding roads leading to Cedarwood. "Mom, did you see this?" Jack called from the office, his laptop open in front of him. "What's up, Jack?" Ella replied, walking over. Jack turned the screen toward her. "These guys, they're called the Red Viper Syndicate. A few towns over, they've been moving in. First, they offer security services to small businesses, and then they take over." Someone posted this on a local forum. Ella leaned in, studying the post. It described a pattern of intimidation, vandalism, threats, and forced buyouts. It hit too close to home, reminding her of the kinds of operations she had witnessed during her years in military intelligence. "Let's hope they don't find their way here," she said quietly, though a knot tightened in her stomach. The first sign of trouble came later that week when Tom Grady, the owner of Grady's Diner, walked into the garage. Tom was in his late 50s, his once robust frame now slightly stooped from years of hard work. He ran the diner with his wife, Linda, and their place was a hub for Cedarwood's residents. "Morning, Ella," Tom greeted, though his voice lacked its usual cheer. "What's wrong, Tom?" Ella asked, noticing the tension in his posture. Tom sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "These guys came into the diner yesterday. Said they were offering security services. When I told them I wasn't interested, they got insistent. One of them knocked over a stack of plates, told me it'd be a shame if something happened to the place." Ella frowned. "Did you call Sheriff Blake?" Tom hesitated. "I thought about it, but Blake's been stretched thin. And I've heard rumors he's not exactly untouched by the kind of money these guys throw around." Ella's jaw tightened. "Don't let them scare you, Tom. If they come back, you call me. And call Blake anyway, even if it's just to document the incident." That night, Ella couldn't shake the conversation with Tom. When she heard the news the next morning that Grady's Diner had been vandalized, its windows smashed and "Pay Up" spray-painted across the front, her blood boiled. Over the next few days, the presence of the Red Viper Syndicate became more noticeable. Their members, easily identifiable by their crimson snake emblems, loitered around town, casting long shadows over Cedarwood's peaceful streets. Ella began hearing more stories from her customers. Mrs. Reynolds, the florist, said they'd visited her shop, suggesting she needed protection against rising crime. Bill Turner, who ran the hardware store, mentioned receiving anonymous threats after refusing to pay. It was clear the Red Vipers were testing the waters, sowing fear to see how far they could push. One evening, Jack came into the kitchen holding his laptop. "Mom, I've been digging into the Red Vipers. They're not just some random gang. They're connected to a corporation called TerraCore International. The company's buying up land and businesses in every town the Vipers hit." Ella raised an eyebrow. "TerraCore? What do they want with small-town businesses?" "They're planning some big infrastructure projects, pipelines, mostly, but they can't build without clearing the towns in their way. The Vipers soften the targets, TerraCore buys up what's left, and they move on." Ella nodded, her military instincts kicking in. This wasn't just a random criminal group. It was an organized operation with corporate backing. "What do we do, Mom?" Jack asked, his voice tinged with worry. Ella placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We protect our town, but we do it smart. They've underestimated Cedarwood, and that's their first mistake." A few days later, Ella had her first direct encounter with the Red Vipers. She was working on a pickup truck when three men strolled into the garage. "Nice place you've got here," one of them said, his voice oozing false charm. He was tall, with a crooked nose and a scar running down his cheek. His companions, both muscular and tattooed, stood behind him, their presence intimidating. "What do you want?" Ella asked, not bothering to mask her disdain. "We're offering a little service," the man said, leaning against her workbench. "Protection. You know, in case anything unfortunate happens." Ella set down her wrench and crossed her arms. "I don't need protection." The man's smile faded. "You sure about that? Things can get messy real fast for folks who don't cooperate." Ella stepped closer, her voice calm but firm. "Let me make myself clear. I don't scare easy. If you or your friends think you can bully me, you're in for a surprise." The man studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "You'll regret this," he said before turning to leave, his lackeys following him. As soon as they were gone, Ella locked up the garage and started installing a new set of security cameras. That night, as Ella reviewed the footage from her cameras, she noticed movement outside. A group of men were gathered near the garage, whispering and gesturing toward the building. She immediately called Sheriff Blake. "Blake, it's Ella. I need you at my garage. Now." By the time Blake arrived, the men had disappeared, but not before leaving a message spray-painted on the side of the building. "Last warning." Blake shook his head, his expression grim. "This is getting out of hand." Ella crossed her arms. "Then it's time to do something about it. If you're not going to act, I will." Blake sighed. "Ella, I know you're capable, but these guys play dirty. You're not in the military anymore." "No, but I know how to fight back," she said. The chapter ends with Ella making a decision. She wouldn't wait for the Red Vipers to tighten their grip on Cedarwood. She would gather allies, expose their operations, and protect her town, no matter the cost. Cedarwood was changing, and not for the better. A week after the Red Viper Syndicate made its presence known, the town's once bustling streets grew quieter. Fewer people lingered outside businesses. Many avoided eye contact with strangers. Fear crept into conversations at the diner and church gatherings, like a shadow stretching across the town. Ella Whitaker knew that fear was the Red Viper Syndicate's first weapon. If they could make the town feel isolated and powerless, resistance would crumble before it began. "You can't let them win," Ella told Tom Grady one morning as they sat in his vandalized diner. Jack was with them, typing furiously on his laptop at the corner booth. Tom sighed. "It's easy for you to say. You don't have a mortgage riding on your business, Ella." "I've got something more valuable to protect," Ella replied, her eyes flicking to Jack. "And so do you. Linda and your staff depend on this place." Before Tom could reply, Jack interrupted. "Mom, come look at this." Ella joined him at the booth, where his screen displayed a map with red markers scattered across the surrounding towns. "What am I looking at?" she asked. "Everywhere the Red Vipers have been," Jack explained. "I cross-referenced the vandalism reports with land sales records. Look, each marker is a business that resisted them. Most of these places were eventually sold to a single buyer, Terracor International." Ella's jaw tightened. "So it's not just Cedarwood. This is a pattern." "And here's the kicker," Jack said, pulling up another window. Terracor's zoning applications show plans for a pipeline cutting straight through these towns. They're wiping out local businesses to make way for infrastructure. Ella leaned back, her mind already spinning with possibilities. "If we can prove that connection, we can get outside help. This is bigger than Cedarwood." The proof wasn't going to come easily. That afternoon, Ella visited Sheriff Blake to share what Jack had uncovered. Blake leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Ella, I don't doubt you've got something here, but connecting dots on paper isn't enough. Without hard evidence, this won't stick. So what are you going to do?" Ella asked. Blake sighed. "I'm stretched thin. Half the department's resources are tied up handling other cases, and the other half," he hesitated, glancing at his desk, "they're compromised, aren't they?" Ella pressed. Blake nodded reluctantly. "I can't prove it, but I know a couple of my deputies have been cozying up to the wrong people. I'm trying to clean house, but it's going to take time." Ella stood, her expression resolute. "Time isn't a luxury we have. If you're not going to act, I'll start gathering evidence myself." Blake's eyes narrowed. "You're putting yourself in danger, Ella." These guys don't play fair. They came after my family in my town. I'm not playing either, she replied, leaving without another word. Ella's first move was to rally Cedarwood's business owners. She and Jack called a meeting at the garage, inviting anyone willing to listen. The first thing Ella Whitaker did after the attack on her garage was fix the broken window. Jack wanted her to call it a day, but Ella knew better. A shattered window wasn't just damage, it was a message. Every hammer strike as she replaced the glass was an answer, a declaration that she wouldn't back down. The Red Vipers weren't going to win this war. Not here. Not in Cedarwood. The town wasn't the same anymore. Fear hung in the air like a storm cloud, thick and oppressive. People whispered about the syndicate in hushed tones at the diner, careful not to be overheard. Businesses that had once thrived were closing early, their owners too afraid to stay open after dark. Ella could see it happening. Cedarwood was fracturing. They're isolating us, she said as she surveyed the shop that evening. Jack was at the workbench, piecing together a new server for their website after the last one had been compromised. That's their strategy, Jack replied, not looking up. Divide and conquer. If they make people feel like they're alone, they'll give up faster. Ella sat down beside him, her arms crossed. That's why we need to push back harder. We've got the evidence from the laptop Blake and I recovered. Now we need to use it. Jack spun his chair around to face her. You think it's enough? Not yet, Ella admitted. We need more. A paper trail, names, connections, everything that ties the Vipers to TerraCore. Jack thought for a moment, then nodded. Okay, I'll start digging deeper. There's bound to be more data on their servers. If I can find a way in. Be careful, Jack, Ella warned. They've already noticed what you're doing. They'll come after you if you get too close. Jack grinned. Let them try. By the next morning, Ella had mobilized the few allies still willing to stand by her. Tom Grady, Maggie Carter, and Sheriff Blake gathered at the diner to discuss their next steps. The attack on your shop was a message, Blake said as they sat around the table. But it's also a sign they're feeling the heat. They wouldn't go this far if they weren't worried about what you're uncovering. Maggie leaned forward, her brow furrowed. So what's our move? Do we go public with what we have? Not yet, Ella replied. We need to make sure the story sticks. If we go out half-cocked, TerraCore will bury us in lawsuits and counterclaims. We need irrefutable evidence, and we need to make it loud enough that they can't silence it. Tom glanced nervously at the door, lowering his voice. I don't know if we've got enough time. People are scared, Ella. My staff's already talking about leaving town. They don't want to end up like the last guy who stood up to the Vipers. Ella's jaw tightened. Then we need to remind them they're not alone. If we can rally the town, we can fight back. Blake nodded. I'll see if I can put some pressure on my deputies, get them to start patrolling more actively. The last thing we need is the Vipers thinking they can act with impunity. And I'll start digging through public records, Maggie said. If there's a paper trail linking TerraCore to this pipeline project, I'll find it. Meanwhile, Jack was making progress of his own. That afternoon, he managed to infiltrate a secondary server tied to TerraCore's operations. What he found was chilling. Emails between TerraCore executives and the Red Vipers detailing payments, land acquisitions, and plans to intimidate towns into submission. Mom, Jack called, his voice shaking. You need to see this. Ella joined him at the workbench, her heart sinking as she read through the emails. One in particular caught her eye, a message from a TerraCore executive to Lucas Kane, the leader of the Red Vipers, outlining their strategy for Cedarwood. They're planning to start evictions in 3 months, Ella said, her voice grim. If they can't buy out the businesses, they'll pressure the landlords. They want to turn Cedarwood into a ghost town. Jack leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. We have to stop them. We will, Ella said, placing a hand on his shoulder. But we need to be smart about it. If they know we have this, they'll escalate. Jack hesitated, then nodded. I'll encrypt the files and upload them to a secure cloud. That way, even if they come from my computer, they won't find anything. Ella smiled. Good thinking. That night, Ella reached out to a journalist she knew from her military days, a woman named Rachel Finn who had a reputation for taking on powerful corporations. Rachel agreed to meet them in Cedarwood the following week, intrigued by the evidence Ella had gathered. But the Vipers were already one step ahead. The next morning, Cedarwood woke to find its internet service disrupted. Jack immediately suspected sabotage, and a quick check confirmed it. The local ISP had been pressured to throttle access, cutting off communications to and from the town. "They're trying to isolate us even more," Jack said, frustration evident in his voice. Ella nodded. "Then we work offline. Start printing copies of the evidence. We'll distribute them by hand if we have to." As the week progressed, the Vipers ramped up their efforts. Maggie's office was hit again, this time with a fire that destroyed her files. Tom's diner was spray-painted with threats, and Blake's squad car was vandalized while parked outside his home. But instead of breaking the town, the attacks galvanized the community. More people began attending the meetings at Ella's garage, each bringing their own stories of intimidation. Some came with evidence, photos, emails, and receipts linking the Vipers to TerraCore. "We're building a case," Ella said during one of the meetings, spreading the evidence across her workbench. "And when we're ready, we'll hit them where it hurts." The breaking point came 2 nights later. Jack's encrypted cloud was hacked, and the files he had uploaded disappeared. A chilling message appeared on his screen. "We warned you." Jack slammed his laptop shut, his face pale. "They got in. I don't know how, but they got in." Ella's blood ran cold. "We need to act now. If they're this desperate, it means we're closer to the truth than ever." That same night, Ella's garage was surrounded by a group of Red Viper enforcers. They smashed windows, slashed tires, and shouted threats, but Ella was ready. She activated the floodlights she'd installed around the property, blinding the intruders and forcing them to retreat. Blake arrived minutes later, his siren scattering the remaining Vipers. As the dust settled, Ella stood in the middle of the wreckage, her resolve unshaken. "They think they can scare us into submission," she said to Jack, who stood beside her. "But all they've done is prove they're afraid of what we're capable of." By the end of the chapter, Ella and her allies had solidified their plan. They would deliver their evidence to Rachel Finn, bypassing the local authorities entirely. With the journalists' help, they would shine a spotlight on TerraCore's corruption and expose the Red Vipers for what they truly were. Cedarwood was under siege, but its people were no longer afraid. Together, they were building a network of resistance, one that the Vipers couldn't break. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, Ella felt hope. Ella Whitaker stood in her garage, her hands resting on the workbench cluttered with tools and papers. Around her, a dozen Cedarwood residents crowded into the space, the tension thick in the air. Tom Grady leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his jaw set in frustration. Maggie Carter was thumbing through a stack of files, her usually calm demeanor tinged with urgency. Sheriff Blake stood near the door, scanning the room with sharp eyes. Jack sat at the workbench, typing furiously on his laptop, the glow of the screen reflecting off his glasses. He was sifting through encrypted files he had recovered after the Red Vipers hacked his cloud server. The boy was determined, even though Ella could see the toll it was taking on him. "We've got less time than I thought," Ella said, addressing the group. She held up a map Jack had printed, marked with red circles showing TerraCore's planned pipeline routes. "They're accelerating their timeline. If we don't act now, we'll lose Cedarwood." "And what exactly do we do?" Tom asked, his voice edged with doubt. "They've already scared half the town into silence. The rest are too afraid to come forward." Ella's gaze swept the room. "We fight back. Not with violence, but with information. Every threat, every piece of evidence, we document it. Then we expose them so loudly they can't bury it." Maggie nodded. "I've been compiling every legal angle we can use. If we can prove TerraCore's connection to the Vipers, we might be able to get a federal investigation." Blake added, "I've got a contact at the state level. He's willing to help, but only if we give him something solid." "That's where Rachel Finn comes in," Ella said. "She'll be here tomorrow. If we can get her the evidence, she'll make sure it reaches the national stage." Jack looked up from his laptop. "I've got more files decrypted. They detail payments from TerraCore to a shell company linked to Lucas Kane. It's the smoking gun we need." "Good work," Ella said, squeezing his shoulder. "Let's keep the pressure on." The next day, Cedarwood braced itself. News of Rachel Finn's arrival spread quickly, and it didn't take long for the Red Vipers to hear about it. Lucas Kane wasted no time escalating his tactics. Maggie's car was found with slashed tires, and Tom received an anonymous phone call warning him to stay out of the fight. Even Blake wasn't spared. A threatening note was left on his squad car, promising consequences if he didn't back off. But despite the intimidation, the town began to rally. Ella's defiance was infectious, and a growing number of residents quietly passed along tips, evidence, and offers of help. Jack's website, now hosted on a secure server, became a hub for people to share their stories anonymously. That afternoon, Rachel arrived in Cedarwood. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, with a no-nonsense demeanor and a reputation for fearlessness. Ella greeted her at the garage, introducing her to the group. "Welcome to Cedarwood," Ella said, shaking Rachel's hand. "Thanks," Rachel replied, looking around. "This place feels like it's ready for a fight." "It is," Ella said. "We just need your help to get our story out there." Rachel spent the next few hours reviewing the evidence, her expression growing graver with each document and file she examined. "This is big," she finally said. "If we can corroborate everything here, it's enough to launch a federal investigation. But it also makes you a target. Are you ready for what comes next?" "We don't have a choice," Ella replied. That evening, the Red Vipers made their move. A convoy of motorcycles roared into Cedarwood, their engines echoing through the empty streets. Ella, watching through her newly installed security cameras, saw them splitting into groups, each heading toward a different part of town. "They're going to hit multiple targets," she told Jack. "We have to warn people," Jack said, already reaching for his phone. "No," Ella said, her voice firm. "We've prepared for this. Let them make their moves. We'll use it against them." She picked up her radio and issued a series of instructions to her allies. Tom and Maggie secured the diner and law office, while Blake mobilized a few trusted deputies to patrol the streets. Meanwhile, Jack monitored the cameras, recording every move the Vipers made. The attacks began almost immediately. The Vipers vandalized businesses, smashed windows, and spray-painted threats. But for every act of intimidation, Ella and her team were ready. Cameras captured their actions, residents documented the damage, and within hours, the footage was uploaded to Jack's website. The next morning, the headlines were unavoidable. Rachel's article, accompanied by video evidence, painted a damning picture of TerraCore and the Red Vipers. It detailed their pattern of intimidation, the corporate backing, and the human cost to small towns like Cedarwood. The story went viral. News outlets picked it up, and social media exploded with outrage. The Red Vipers had relied on fear and silence to operate, but now the spotlight was on them, and there was nowhere to hide. Lucas Kane was livid. That afternoon, he stormed into Cedarwood with a dozen enforcers, determined to put an end to the resistance. They surrounded Ella's garage, their presence a clear warning. Kane stepped forward, his cold eyes locking onto Ella as she stood at the entrance. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he sneered. "All you've done is make things worse for yourself." Ella didn't flinch. "What's the matter, Kane? Losing your grip?" Kane's jaw tightened. "This is your last chance. Shut this down, or I'll make sure you and your kid regret it." Ella took a step closer, her voice low and steady. "You already made me regret not stopping you sooner. Get off my property, or I'll show you what a real fight looks like." For a moment, Kane hesitated. Then he smirked and motioned for his men to leave. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts won't save you." As the Vipers roared away, Ella turned to find Jack watching from the office window. "You okay, Mom?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said. "But this isn't over." That night, Ella gathered her allies once more. The attacks had left the town shaken, but not broken. Residents were starting to see that standing together was their best chance at survival. "They're trying to break us," Ella told the group. "But every time they hit us, we hit back harder. We've got the evidence, we've got the story, and now we've got the world watching." Tom nodded. "We're with you, Ella. All the way." Maggie added, "I've been in touch with some lawyers who specialize in corporate corruption cases. They're interested in helping, pro bono." Blake looked around the room. "The state authorities are paying attention now. If we can keep the pressure on, they'll have no choice but to act." Ella felt a spark of hope. Cedarwood was no longer a town under siege. It was a town fighting back. and for the first time, she believed they could win. The town of Cedarwood had been many things over the years: quiet, tight-knit, resilient. Now, it was a battlefield, not of bullets or fists, but of information and fear. The Red Viper Syndicate had pushed hard, escalating their tactics to terrorize the community. But Ella Whitaker and her growing network of allies had pushed back harder. Cedarwood's fight for survival was no longer just a local struggle. It had become a national story. The fallout from Rachel Finn's article was immediate. Networks picked up her piece, broadcasting footage of the Red Viper's intimidation tactics and TerraCore's deep ties to the syndicate. Social media exploded with hashtags like #SaveCedarwood and #CorporateCorruption. Other towns started coming forward with their own stories, describing eerily similar patterns of extortion and forced takeovers. Cedarwood's defiance had lit a spark. Ella sat in the garage's office, reviewing emails and messages on her laptop. The noise of Jack clacking away at his keyboard filled the room. "Rachel's story is everywhere," Jack said, leaning back in his chair. "Even big corporate accounts are tweeting about it. People are furious." Ella nodded, but kept her focus on the screen. "Fury is good, but it won't stop TerraCore. They'll try to spin this, turn public opinion in their favor. We need more than outrage. We need undeniable proof they've broken the law." Jack hesitated. "Mom, I found something." Ella turned her attention to him. "What is it?" Jack tilted his laptop to show her a series of encrypted files. "I dug deeper into TerraCore's network. These are financial records, offshore accounts, fake invoices, payouts to the Vipers. It's a money trail linking TerraCore directly to everything happening here. But there's one more thing." Jack pulled up a document titled Eviction Protocols. Ella's stomach churned as she read it. The document outlined plans for widespread evictions in Cedarwood, targeting not just businesses but residents. TerraCore's goal wasn't just to scare people into selling. It was to empty the town entirely. "This is it," Ella said, her voice steady despite the anger rising within her. "This is the kind of evidence that gets federal investigators to act." Ella called a meeting at the diner that evening. It wasn't just her close allies this time. Word had spread, and nearly 50 people crowded into the space, the largest gathering since the town's fight had begun. Ella stood at the front, the eviction plans projected on a screen behind her. "This is what we're up against," she said, her voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "They don't just want our businesses, they want to erase this town. Everything we've built, everything we've worked for, gone." The room was silent, the weight of her words sinking in. "But they made a mistake," she continued. "They underestimated us. We've gathered enough evidence to expose TerraCore's entire operation. If we stand together, we can stop them. But we need to act fast." Sheriff Blake spoke next, detailing the steps they were taking to protect residents. Maggie Carter explained how the legal case was shaping up, while Jack outlined how their website was helping other towns share their stories. When the meeting ended, the mood was different. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was determination. The Red Vipers retaliated the next day. Ella woke to find the windows of her garage shattered again, and her tires slashed. Across town, similar acts of vandalism targeted anyone who had attended the meeting. Maggie's law office was broken into again. Tom's diner was spray-painted with more threats. Ella called Blake immediately. "They're escalating," she said. "They're desperate," Blake replied. "That means we're getting to them." But the Vipers didn't stop with intimidation. Later that afternoon, Jack called Ella from school, his voice shaky. "Mom, something's wrong. There are men here, dressed like security guards. They're saying they're here to review the computers for safety concerns." Ella's blood ran cold. "Stay with Elizabeth," she said, referring to the teacher who had been keeping an eye on Jack. "I'm on my way." When Ella arrived, she found the school in chaos. The security guards were combing through the computer lab, confiscating hard drives and devices. Jack stood near the door with Elizabeth, his arms crossed defiantly. Ella marched up to the group's leader, a smug-looking man in a suit. "What do you think you're doing?" The man smirked. "Just conducting a routine inspection. There have been reports of unauthorized internet activity originating from this school." "That's a lie, and you know it," Ella said, her voice low and dangerous. The man's smirk faltered. I suggest you stay out of this, Ms. Whitaker. It's a matter of security. Get out, Ella snapped, or I'll have every camera in this building broadcasting your little inspection to the national news within the hour. The man glared at her, but eventually signaled his team to leave. Ella watched them go, her hands clenched into fists. That evening, Rachel Finn called with an update. Ella, the story's gone nuclear, she said. We've got whistleblowers coming forward from TerraCore. They're confirming everything: illegal evictions, corporate espionage, even bribes to local officials. Does that mean the feds are getting involved? Ella asked. Not yet, Rachel replied. But it's only a matter of time. Keep the pressure on. They're going to come after you hard now. Rachel was right. The next day, Cedarwood was swarmed with corporate contractors hired by TerraCore. They weren't subtle. Black SUVs patrolled the streets, and groups of men in suits visited businesses and homes, trying to intimidate anyone who had spoken out. But the town didn't back down. Ella and Jack continued to publish new evidence, while Blake and Maggie worked to ensure residents knew their rights. The people of Cedarwood were scared, but they stood firm. TerraCore's arrogance was its undoing. Every heavy-handed tactic, every thinly veiled threat, only added to the mountain of evidence piling up against them. 2 days later, the breakthrough finally came. A federal whistleblower leaked internal TerraCore memos to Rachel Finn, revealing direct orders from the company's executives to use the Red Vipers as enforcers. The memos included names, dates, and even financial transactions. Rachel published the memos immediately, and within hours, federal agents descended on TerraCore's headquarters. News helicopters circled the building, capturing the arrests of high-ranking executives. The crackdown didn't stop there. Lucas Kane and several members of the Red Vipers were taken into custody that same evening. Cedarwood erupted in celebration as news of the arrests spread. That night, Ella and Jack sat on the porch of their house, watching the quiet streets of Cedarwood. You did it, Jack said, his voice filled with awe. We did it, Ella corrected, smiling at him. This wasn't just me, Jack. This was everyone. The town stood together, and that's why we won. Jack leaned back in his chair, a satisfied grin on his face. So, what happens now? Now, Ella said, we rebuild, and we make sure nothing like this ever happens again. The sun rose over Cedarwood the morning after the federal crackdown, painting the town in shades of gold and hope. The arrests of Lucas Kane and several high-ranking members of the Red Vipers had lifted a heavy weight off the community. For the first time in months, Cedarwood's residents could breathe a little easier. But Ella Whitaker knew better than to celebrate too soon. While the arrests had dealt a significant blow, TerraCore remained intact. The corporation had too many resources, too many connections, to fall from a single setback. The fight wasn't over, not yet. Ella sat at her kitchen table, a cup of coffee in her hand and her laptop open in front of her. Jack joined her, still groggy from the late night. They'd spent updating their website with the latest developments. Mom, he said, rubbing his eyes, what's our next move? Ella leaned back in her chair. We keep digging. TerraCore's playbook doesn't change. If they've done this here, they've done it elsewhere. We need to find the bigger picture, their endgame. Jack opened his laptop, pulling up encrypted files he'd been combing through. I found something last night. There's a division within TerraCore called Strategic Expansion Initiatives. They're behind most of the evictions and land grabs, but it goes deeper than just pipelines. They're targeting regions with untapped resources, minerals, water, land for development. Ella frowned. So Cedarwood was just one piece of a much larger operation. Jack nodded. If we can expose the whole network, it'll bring them down for good. By mid-morning, Ella was meeting with Sheriff Blake and Maggie Carter at the diner. Tom Grady brought them coffee as they discussed their next steps. Blake tapped his pen against the table. The feds are focused on TerraCore's executive team, but they haven't connected the dots yet. They're treating this as a one-off case of corporate corruption, not a systemic problem. That's because they don't have the full picture, Maggie said. We need to give it to them. If we can prove this is part of a larger operation, it'll force a broader investigation. Ella nodded. Jack found some files that might help. I'll have him pull the data together into a report. Maggie, can you reach out to your legal contacts? If we can get a class action suit going, it'll add pressure. Maggie smiled. Already on it. And I'll keep my deputies on high alert, Blake said. The Vipers might be out of the picture, but TerraCore still has muscle. They're not going to go quietly. That evening, Ella and Jack worked late into the night compiling the evidence. Jack had uncovered emails, financial records, and contracts that painted a damning picture of TerraCore's operations. This is huge, Jack said, scrolling through the files. They've got their hands in everything: mining, pipelines, even land development for luxury resorts. They're using syndicates like the Vipers to clear the way. Ella studied the files, her military instincts kicking in. This isn't just about money. They're building an empire, one small town at a time. If we expose this, it won't just stop them. It'll change the way corporations operate. Jack grinned. Sounds like a plan. The next day, Cedarwood was hit with another wave of retaliation. Black SUVs rolled into town, their windows tinted and their occupants silent. The contractors inside weren't as overt as the Red Vipers, but their presence was just as menacing. Blake called Ella shortly after the SUVs arrived. They're back, he said. This time it's TerraCore's private security. They're claiming they're here to protect corporate interests. Ella clenched her jaw. They're here to intimidate us. Blake sighed. Probably. But they've got paperwork and lawyers. They're walking a fine line, just enough to avoid breaking the law. Ella hung up and called a meeting with her allies. The diner was packed that evening, the tension palpable. Maggie spread a map across the table, marking the locations where the SUVs had been spotted. They're focusing on businesses that have supported us, she said. Tom's Diner, the hardware store, even the florist. They're trying to isolate us again. Ella nodded. We need to stay ahead of them. Document everything they do. If they so much as cross the line, we'll make sure it's public knowledge. Blake added, I've got deputies watching their movements. We'll keep them in check, but we need to be careful. They're playing by the rules, even if it's just barely. That night, Ella and Jack prepared for the worst. They set up additional security cameras around the garage and backed up all their files onto encrypted drives. Ella's military training told her the next escalation wouldn't be subtle. Around midnight, her instincts were proven right. The sound of engines woke Ella from a restless sleep. She grabbed her jacket and rushed to the garage, where Jack was already monitoring the security feeds. They're here, Jack said, pointing to the screen. A group of men dressed in black had gathered outside the garage, their faces obscured by masks. Ella called Blake immediately. We've got intruders. I'm on my way, Blake replied. Ella didn't wait. She stepped outside, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The men froze, startled by her sudden appearance. This is private property, she said, her voice steady. Leave now, or you'll regret it. One of the men stepped forward, his posture threatening. You think you can stop us, lady? You have no idea who you're dealing with. Ella didn't flinch. No, but I know exactly what kind of coward sends masked men to do their dirty work. The standoff ended when Blake arrived with his deputies, their sirens scattering the intruders. The next morning, Ella's garage was abuzz with activity. Residents stopped by to check on her, offering support and sharing stories of their own encounters with TerraCore security. The attacks had galvanized the town once again, but Ella knew they couldn't sustain this forever. TerraCore was a giant, and Cedarwood was a single small town. If they were going to win, they needed to take the fight to a larger stage. The chapter ends with Ella finalizing the report she and Jack had compiled. She uploaded the files to Rachel Finn, along with a message. This isn't just Cedarwood's fight anymore. It's time to bring the whole system down. Cedarwood was on edge. The arrests of Lucas Kane and the Red Vipers had shifted the balance of power, but TerraCore wasn't retreating. Instead, the corporation had sent its private security teams to reinforce its presence. The shiny black SUVs parked conspicuously around town were no longer just vehicles. They were symbols of intimidation, reminders that the fight was far from over. Ella Whitaker knew this wasn't a battle they could win through resistance alone. TerraCore's reach was vast, and its tactics were precise. They weren't breaking laws outright. They were twisting them, exploiting loopholes, and using their resources to wear down Cedarwood's resolve. If Ella and her team were going to succeed, they needed to shift the battlefield entirely. The morning air was brisk as Ella met with her allies at the diner. Maggie Carter had brought copies of legal documents she'd uncovered, leases, contracts, and eviction notices that painted a damning picture of TerraCore's plans for Cedarwood. Sheriff Blake, who looked more exhausted than ever, had a list of reports from residents about suspicious activity by TerraCore's contractors. Jack sat beside Ella, a coffee mug in one hand and his laptop in the other. He had barely slept, but his energy was focused and relentless. "They're laying the groundwork for a complete takeover," Maggie explained, pointing to the documents spread across the table. "They're using technicalities to push businesses out, revoking permits, invalidating contracts, and tying people up in court until they can't fight anymore." Tom Grady slammed his fist on the table. "How is this even legal?" "It's not entirely," Maggie replied, "but it's just gray enough to slow down any real consequences." Ella leaned forward. "Then we need to speed things up. Jack, how are we doing on getting this out?" Jack tapped his keyboard. "Rachel's already started distributing the files we sent her. They've been picked up by a few major outlets. But if we really want to hit them where it hurts, we need more. Something undeniable." By mid-afternoon, Ella and Jack were back at the garage, reviewing files Jack had extracted from TerraCore's network. One document caught Ella's attention: a detailed timeline for Phase 2. It outlined a strategy for locking down Cedarwood entirely, using eminent domain to force residents off their land. Ella's blood ran cold. This isn't just about business. They want the whole town gone. Jack's eyes widened. They're planning to move in next month. That's when they'll start filing the legal paperwork to evict people. Ella stared at the screen, her mind racing. "We can't let it get that far. We need to force their hand now." That evening, Ella called a town meeting at the community center. It was the largest gathering yet. Nearly 100 residents packed the room, their faces a mix of fear and determination. Ella stood at the front, holding a stack of papers. "I know you're all scared. I am too. But this is our home. If we don't fight for it, no one will." She handed the papers to Maggie, who distributed them to the crowd. "These documents prove that TerraCore isn't just targeting businesses. They're targeting every single one of us. They want Cedarwood gone, and they're using every dirty trick in the book to make it happen." The room buzzed with anger and disbelief as residents read the papers. "We can't stop them," someone said from the back. "They're too powerful." "No, they're not," Ella replied, her voice firm. "They want us to believe we're powerless, but we're not. We've already proven we can fight back. The story is out, and people are listening. Now we need to make it impossible for them to ignore us." Maggie stepped forward. "We've filed an emergency injunction to block TerraCore's eviction plans. It's a long shot, but it'll buy us time. In the meantime, we need to keep building our case." Blake added, "I've reached out to some contacts at the state level. If we can prove TerraCore is breaking federal laws, we can get more agencies involved. But we need evidence, something they can't explain away." As the meeting ended, the residents left with renewed purpose. For the first time, Cedarwood felt like a united front. But Ella knew the fight wasn't over. That night, as she and Jack reviewed the files again, they found a new lead: a series of emails between TerraCore executives discussing a meeting at a nearby resort. The subject line read, "Final coordination, Cedarwood takeover." "They're meeting tomorrow," Jack said. "If we can get in there and record what they're saying, it could blow this wide open." Ella hesitated. "It's risky. They'll have security everywhere." "Then we'll plan it carefully," Jack replied. "This might be our best shot." The next day, Ella, Jack, and Rachel Finn drove to the resort, armed with hidden cameras and recording devices. Rachel had arranged for a room at the resort under an alias, giving them a base of operations. Through binoculars, they watched as sleek cars pulled into the parking lot. Men and women in tailored suits emerged, each one looking more powerful than the last. "That's TerraCore's VP of Operations," Rachel whispered, pointing to a tall man stepping out of a black sedan. "And that's their legal counsel." Ella's eyes narrowed. This is it. They're coordinating the final push. Jack set up a directional microphone, aiming it at the conference room where the executives had gathered. Through the headphones, they could hear snippets of conversation, enough to confirm that the meeting was about Cedarwood. "We need to get closer," Ella said. Rachel hesitated. You're sure? If they catch us? They won't, Ella said. We'll be careful. Ella slipped into the resort's lobby, her posture casual but her senses alert. Jack stayed outside with Rachel, monitoring the equipment. Ella wore a maintenance uniform she'd borrowed from the hotel staff, blending in as she walked past the conference room. Through the slightly open door, she caught a glimpse of the meeting. A dozen executives seated around a table, charts and maps displayed on a projector. We need to move quickly, one of the men was saying. The media coverage has complicated things, but if we secure the land before the injunction holds, we'll be untouchable. Ella adjusted her phone, ensuring it was recording. She stayed just long enough to capture their plans before slipping back out. That night, they reviewed the footage. It was damning, clear evidence of TerraCore's intent to bypass legal procedures and use underhanded tactics to take over Cedarwood. Rachel smiled. This is it. This is the nail in their coffin. The chapter ends with Ella and her team uploading the recordings to Rachel's network. Within hours, the story spreads, triggering an immediate federal investigation. TerraCore's executives are subpoenaed, and the tide begins to turn. Cedarwood's resistance has reached its tipping point. The town isn't just fighting for itself anymore. It's leading the charge against a corrupt system, inspiring other communities to stand up and fight back. The fallout from Ella Whitaker's recording was immediate. The video, shared by Rachel Finn's network, became a sensation overnight. TerraCore executives were seen plotting the illegal takeover of Cedarwood, casually discussing eviction timelines and corporate tactics that flouted the law. Major news outlets aired the footage, analysts dissected it, and social media exploded with outrage. But Cedarwood's battle wasn't over. As federal investigators descended on TerraCore's offices, the corporation launched its final counterstrike. Black SUVs once again rolled into town, and this time, the men who stepped out weren't just security contractors, they were enforcers. Their mission was clear: silence Cedarwood's resistance by any means necessary. Ella sat in her garage with Jack, Rachel, Maggie, and Sheriff Blake, reviewing the latest updates. A sense of triumph lingered in the air, but it was overshadowed by unease. TerraCore's backed into a corner, Maggie said. They've lost public support, and the feds are closing in. But that makes them more dangerous. Rachel nodded. They still have resources, lawyers, lobbyists, private security. They'll try to spin this, delay the investigations, and intimidate anyone who stands in their way. Ella stood, her face resolute. Then we stay ahead of them. They've underestimated us this whole time. Let's make sure they keep doing that. By midday, Cedarwood was under siege. The enforcers patrolled the streets, stopping cars and harassing residents. Businesses that had been vocal in supporting Ella were targeted with sudden inspections, fines, and veiled threats. At Tom's Diner, two men in suits entered and sat at a booth without ordering. When Tom asked them to leave, they calmly placed a stack of legal papers on the counter. Violation of health codes, one of the men said with a smirk. Unless you'd like to discuss a settlement. Tom, his hands shaking, called Ella. They're going after everyone who's helped us, Tom said, his voice tight with fear. They want to break us, Ella replied. But all they're doing is giving us more proof. The turning point came later that afternoon. Jack, monitoring TerraCore's network, intercepted an email marked priority, internal only. It was a directive from TerraCore's legal counsel to their enforcers, instructing them to seize specific properties in Cedarwood under the guise of legal repossession. Mom, Jack said, his voice urgent. This is it. They're making their move tonight. Ella read the email, her stomach tightening. They're going to take the businesses that are the most vocal against them. If they get their hands on those properties, they'll use them as leverage to scare everyone else into silence. What do we do? Jack asked. Ella's eyes hardened. We stop them. All of us. That evening, Ella called a town meeting at the community center. The room was packed, the fear on people's faces palpable. They're coming tonight, Ella said, holding up a printout of the intercepted email. They're going to seize our businesses, claiming it's legal. But we know it's not, and we're not going to let them get away with it. How do we stop them? Someone asked. By standing together, Ella replied. If we're there, documenting everything, they can't act without exposing themselves. We've already shown the world what they're capable of. Now we show them that we won't back down. Sheriff Blake stepped forward. I've got deputies stationed around town. If they try anything illegal, we'll arrest them. But I need you all to stay calm. No violence, no provocation. We win this by doing things the right way, Maggie added. And if they try to intimidate you, remember, they're scared. They know we're winning. As night fell, Cedarwood prepared for the confrontation. Residents armed themselves with cameras, phones, and notepads, ready to document every move TerraCore's enforcers made. Blake and his deputies patrolled the streets, their presence a reassuring sight. Ella and Jack set up a command center in the garage, monitoring security feeds and coordinating with Maggie and Rachel. They're on the move, Jack said, pointing to one of the screens. A convoy of SUVs was approaching Cedarwood from the south. Here we go, Ella muttered. The SUVs stopped outside the hardware store first. A group of enforcers exited, carrying clipboards and tools to change locks. But before they could act, a crowd of residents surrounded them, phones,